Well, howdy everyone. Fans of ultra-wide-angle photography might be interested in the Sigma lens I'm looking at today, the 12 to 24mm f4.5 to 5.6 DG HSM 2. Very few full-frame camera lenses can go as wide as 12mm, which is extreme enough to also be an ultra-wide-angle on smaller censored APS-C cameras. 12mm. Let's see just how wide that really is on a full-frame camera. As you can see here, most standard zoom lenses for full-frame go as wide-angle as 24mm. Well, the Sigma 12 to 24mm lens picks up from there and goes back to a crazy wide angle that very few other lenses can achieve. It's quite astonishing just how wide 12mm really is. It's useful for squeezing in huge landscapes if you live in a part of the world where they're readily available. 12mm is also pretty useful for getting creative pictures with some extreme perspectives, and it's also a pretty striking selfie lens if you're that way inclined, although at about £500 or $800 a selfie stick might be a bit more economical. This lens's focal range was pretty unique for a while, until Canon released their new 11 to 24mm f4L lens, with an even wider angle and brighter aperture. The Sigma lens only really has a very narrow aperture, not letting in much light at all. But with the Canon lens costing over £2,000, the Sigma lens is a much more realistic option for wide-angle photography junkies. We'll find out later if its picture quality is good enough for professional use. Firstly though, let's take a look at the build quality. The lens's body is made of metal and it feels tough and weighty, but the lens itself is not too big or heavy. It's not a dreadful burden to bring along with you in your camera bag. It doesn't have image stabilization, although for such a wide-angle lens, that's not really a big problem. The device is built with a fixed metal hood with a detachable tubular lens hood which slides onto the front, and also has an 82mm lens cap which can be taken off. However, with the tubular lens hood attached, you'll get terrible vignetting at angles wider than 24mm. So, unfortunately, you can't effectively use filters with this lens. The zoom ring works reasonably smoothly, it's quite easy to turn. And the lens's focus ring is very well damped and turns extremely smoothly with plenty of precision. The lens features full-time manual focusing, so you can safely adjust the focus at any time. The HSM ultrasonic autofocus motor works very quickly and quietly, as you can see here. The autofocus accuracy was just fine in all my tests, not difficult for an extremely wide-angle lens with a narrow aperture. Overall, the lens's build quality is really beyond reproach. It works fantastically well while being tough but not too cumbersome in use. Okay, let's take a look at image quality. Firstly then, let's test the wide-angle Sigma lens on a full-frame camera, a 20MP Canon 6D. At the maximum aperture of f4.5 at 12mm, the lens's sharpness and contrast in the middle of the frame are bitingly good. Things get more difficult as we look into the corners. Sharpness remains pretty good until we look right into the edges, where the image suddenly becomes quite soft. We also see some obvious issues with yellow and purple chromatic aberration, although apparently it's an improvement over Sigma's original version of the lens. Stop down to f8 for noticeably more sharpness and brightness, although even stop down to f11 there are still a few problems in those corners. Let's zoom in now to 24mm. At the new, darker maximum aperture of f5.6, it's the same good news in the middle of the image with great, sharp picture quality. Over in the corners, sharpness is only good, but at least we don't have that chromatic aberration to deal with anymore. If we stop down to f8, then we get a lot more brightness, but not much more sharpness, and even at f11, image quality isn't totally sharp. So there you have it. On a full-frame camera, the lens puts on a decent show, but the extreme corners are never really very sharp, and at 12mm, there is some quite noticeable colour fringing. Okay, let's see how the lens performs on a crop-censored APS-C camera, in this case an 18MP Canon 60D. Remember, at 12mm this is still an ultra-wide-angle lens on APS-C. At f4.5 we have the same situation as on full frame. Excellent sharpness and contrast in the middle of the image, and problems over in the corners. Even stopping down to f8, there's only a small improvement in sharpness. It's not terribly impressive picture quality. If we zoom in to 24mm, again the middle of the image is good and sharp. The corners are a bit better at 24mm. They're reasonably sharp now that we've zoomed in, with a good reduction in colour fringing. Stopping the aperture down to f8 doesn't really seem to make a difference though. So it's an alright performance on APS-C, but ultra-wide-angle lenses which are specially designed for APS-C cameras can go wider and get sharper. Let's move on then and look at distortion and vignetting on a full-frame camera. At 12mm there's some noticeable barrel distortion, but considering just how wide an angle we're dealing with here, I think it's largely forgivable. A more serious problem are the very dark corners at f4.5. Stop the aperture down to f8 for more brightness in those corners. While I was shooting sample pictures, I often found myself stopping down the aperture to avoid this troublesome vignetting. When we zoom in to 24mm, the lens's projection flips into moderate pincushion distortion, which isn't quite so bad, but again we do deal with some difficult vignetting at the maximum aperture. Stop down to f8 or darker to get rid of it. The lens can focus as closely as about 28cm, about average for an ultra-wide-angle lens. Sharpness close-up is very good, thankfully straight from f4.5, and at any aperture or focal length, so that's a nice brownie point. Let's see how the lens performs against bright lights, a very important question, as a lens with such a wide angle will catch the sun easily in your pictures. As you can see, we get a few noticeable speckles of flaring. However, it's not a bad performance, and contrast is holding up very well, even as you zoom in. Finally, bokeh. It's very difficult to get out of focus backgrounds with such a lens, but when you do, the quality of the bokeh is very nice and smooth, so no problems here. Overall, we can assess the Sigma 12-24mm Mark II lens fairly positively. It's another nice example of the Sigma company's obvious interest in designing lenses of an extreme nature. The lens's build quality is excellent, and its optics are pretty sharp with very good contrast and not too much distortion. It's a fun lens to use, and it's reasonably priced considering what it is. However, the picture quality in the corners of its images never really managed to make a strong impression, and if you're using an APS-C camera, then there are much more appropriate competing lenses out there. For example, the Canon 10-18mm STM, which is a far nicer piece of kit in every way. But for full-frame camera owners who are desperate to get the widest angles possible, there's a lot of fun to be had with the Sigma 12-24.